Hi everyone, I'm recording this class to cover The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, a poem that we didn't have enough time to discuss when we were discussing Poe a couple of classes ago. This also serves as a replacement for the class that we didn't have because of my health problems, but here we are. I'm going to discuss a little bit of The Raven and philosophy of the composition and how that was an essay that Poe produced that approached the structural motivations behind The Raven and all the details of meaning and what he called a unity of effect and how that is translated into The Raven. But not only The Raven, but in general, what Poe believed to be the appropriate structure of a story, which The Raven tells because The Raven is a narrative poem. So unlike the poems that we read by Poe, Annabel Lee being one of them, A Dream being another one, these are lyrical poems. The Raven has a more narrative tone, so it tells a story through its verse, and it has a very specific metrical structure. Okay, so it is a trochaic octameter. So it is a poem mostly composed of a trochaic octameter. So it's a poem mostly composed of a trochaic octameter style or structure, meaning that it has 8 feet per line in a trochee, which means that it's stressed followed by an unstressed syllable. So that means that The Raven is very classically rhythmic, and Poe admits that in his essay. So it has that very distinctive meter or foot, which foot is just a stressed followed by an unstressed syllable or vice versa. So it's once upon a midnight dreary, while it pondered weak and weary, right? So you can see that it has this very tidy rhythm to it, which provides this sort of melancholy ballad format, or it resembles something like that, which Poe uses then to convey the message of a very classic theme behind a lot of his poetry, which is the death of a beloved lady, or someone who the persona of the poem mourns in passing. So in the philosophy of composition, Poe begins the essay arguing that a story can be only truly thought of or planned or structured if the author considers its denouement as the pivotal element guiding that story. And what is the denouement, at least as stated by Poe? It goes back to the Poetics and what Aristotle posited as the desis and lysis, which means the sort of like the tying up and the untying of a story. So today it's usually referred to as the complication and the resolution. Complication being this apex, this climactic moment in a story in which there is a conflict, in which the story is bound together by some sort of complication, of complexity, being it a conflict or something else. Stories are different, they come in different forms, so it doesn't really need to be translated as a complication. And the denouement would be the unbinding or the untying of that complication, so it would be the resolution of the story. Taking that into account, it is the cooling down of a story, the point at which the story comes down from a climax and towards some sort of closure, of sense of closure. So to Poe, that's the first thing that you should take into account if you write a story. And from there, he begins his defense of the shortest story possible. He's basically defending he's arguing for, or he's standing for, the short story as the perfect narrative style of prose, at least. So that's why, and this leads us to understand better his preference for short stories as a prose style or a prose format in which he would base pretty much all of his prose productions. But there is something behind that, and he argues that a story can only truly be appreciated if you read it in one sitting, in just one session. That means that you would be able to absorb all the story has to offer, and you would fully wrap your head around its main complexities, its climax, and its untying of the events, its denouement. And it's by having that sort of dilemma while constructing a story that an author can truly achieve a unity of effect, which means a consistency in what the story is trying to tell. So the message has to be consistent and it has to be contained in just one thing. And by having that unity of effect, you would be able to achieve the true aesthetic pleasure of reading a story, because Poe is arguing for beauty, for the aesthetic value of literature as a form of art. So that would be your end goal as a writer. So to take it from the text, Poe argues that if any literary work is too long to be read at one sitting, we must be content to dispense with the immensely important effect derivable from unity of impression. For if 2 sittings be required, the affairs of the world interfere, and everything like totality is at once destroyed. He ultimately argues that one vastly important artistic element, totality or unity of effect, is paramount to any process of composing a narrative, basically. So that unity of effect, if you read The Raven, you can more or less assume that it is there, because you can read The Raven in one sitting very easily. It's a very practical poem in that sense, even though it's fairly long for today's standards. It wasn't so much for Poe's time. There were, loads of long poems back then being produced up to that point and at that point. But you can theoretically read The Raven in one sitting and then have access to that unity of effect, to that impression of the core elements and themes, be it structural elements or thematic elements in the case of the themes, of this story that's being told in verse. So by making these assertions and by driving these reflections, Poe in this essay tries to tell us that this is what motivated him to write what would be considered the perfect poem, which would have that appropriate length, and to him that is essential to understanding and to appreciating the true beauty of a piece of literary art form. So to him, what would be the ideal length of a poem would be about 100 lines, which would be the base structure behind The Raven. And so he goes into this very detailed explanation, pretty much almost a logical one or a mathematical explanation of how a poem should be structured and how each verse is composed and how the meter of the poem is forethought, and how the rhyming system works to provide that sense of unity in the poem, and The Raven would be an illustration of that, basically. Since for him, in a nutshell, in literature, beauty would be not a quality as is supposed, but an effect. In short, that intense and pure elevation of the soul, not of intellect or of heart, upon which I have commented, and which is experienced in consequence of contemplating the beautiful. Okay, so it's up to you, to anyone in today's standards. Would be very difficult to access that sort of the exact semantic overtone of that word, soul, but we can comprehend as something that is related to that catharsis of the poem or of the story. When you read it, when you get in touch with a piece of art that truly touches you, that would be sort of part of the argument of what Poe is trying to build here. So not of the intellect, not of the heart, but of the soul. Something elevating, something liberating. And this would be what this perfect poem would be about. So that structure, when it comes to the themes themselves, Poe goes into this other line of thought that considers, sadness or melancholy as being central to what would be the perfect story. And to him, the perfect story would be one of mourning, of a beautiful lady, basically. So it goes back to what we read in Annabel Lee, and I approached it, I addressed how that theme is a recurring one in Poe's poetry. Same thing that we saw in Lenore, which is a poem that shares that name, that serves as the object of affection and of mourning in The Raven as well. So there is an establishment of, there is a connection to be established between the two, at least when it comes to that object. And nominally speaking, the name of the object of mourning and of longing, that beautiful lady that has passed away, and the persona is reflecting upon that loss of that person. But to quote from the text, Poe argues that I had now gone so far as a conception of a raven, the bird of ill omen, monotonously repeating the one word nevermore at the conclusion of each stanza in a poem of melancholy tone and in length about 100 lines. So he's mixing up all the thematic and formal elements of the poem. He had already discussed the use of the refrain, which is that extra line at the end of the stanza that repeats the previous line in a shorter foot or in a shorter metrical structure, and the use of the word nevermore as something that a raven, which is a bird that is able to mimic human sounds and words, would utter in that situation, and nevermore being a word that fits right into the situation of the poem, of the story being told. He goes on stating that never losing sight of the object's supremeness of perfection at all points, I asked myself, of all melancholy topics, what, according to the universal understanding of mankind, is the most melancholy? Of course, this is a very idealistic view, but he concludes that death was the obvious reply. And when I said, is this most melancholy of topics most poetical, from what I have already explained at some length, the answer here is also obvious. When it most closely allies itself to beauty, the death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world. And equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover, which is something that we have seen again and again in Poe's poetry, and it's easy to understand why he would return to that narrative logic, because it is a logic that is sort of idealistic. Like I said before about this, what he would consider a universal comprehension or understanding of beauty and of death and of melancholy is a very Western perspective of the motivation behind that story, but also of this love story being heavily autobiographical, being part of his life experience, to have lost someone, to have lost many people over the course of some years, and that would, allegedly inspire the construction of the Raven. So after all this, exploration of the main topics behind the philosophy of composition, I here bring you the activity for Friday. And on Friday, I want each one of you to bring to me one stanza from the Raven that would encapsulate that unity of effect that the Raven brings, having death of a beloved, beautiful lady as its core, as its central thematic element, and the trochaic octameter as its central formal element in a stanza that ends in a refrain, and the repetition being used as a device to convey that message. Any of that can be the motivation behind your argument, but I would like you ultimately to bring one stanza that would encapsulate what the Raven is all about, and justify why, and justify your choice of that stanza. Why is that stanza so representative of the Raven as a whole, as a poem, and why does that stanza contain that unity of effect, be it in its choice of vocabulary, in its semantic undertones, in the details of its meter, or in the choice of the lines and repetition? Whatever you choose to justify your choice, it would be valid. But I would like you to bring that as a point of discussion for the first half of the class. We will still discuss our introduction to theater and to drama, but we will begin the class with that activity on Poe and philosophy of composition as a departing point for our discussion. So this is it. I hope this recorded class was helpful. I hope it can guide your argument and your choice ultimately when we discuss the Raven. I hope to see you all on Friday and later today, but on Friday as well, and that we have this discussion and it's a fruitful one. See you later today and on Friday as well. Bye-bye.